Why did my dad believe his new girlfriend instead of getting me to the hospital? The pain hit me during warm-ups before the regional championship game, a sudden explosion in my chest that made me drop to my knees on the track. Coach Ramsey rushed over while my teammates formed a circle around me, and I tried to explain that something felt wrong inside my ribcage, like my heart was beating wrong, and my lungs couldn't fill properly. The pain radiated down my left arm in waves that made my vision blur, and when I tried to stand, my legs wouldn't support my weight. Coach pulled out his phone to call an ambulance, but Dad appeared from the bleachers with his new girlfriend, Vanessa, and she immediately started talking about how teenage athletes always got nervous before big competitions. She knelt beside me in her expensive athleisure wear and explained in this calm, authoritative voice that she'd been a nursing student before switching majors and knew the signs of a panic attack when she saw one. Dad hesitated with his hand on Coach Ramsey's shoulder and asked if maybe we should just give me a few minutes to calm down and see if the symptoms passed. I managed to gasp out that this wasn't anxiety, that the pain was getting worse and spreading through my chest like something was tearing inside me. Coach Ramsey argued that we needed to call 911 immediately because chest pain in a 17-year-old athlete could indicate serious cardiac problems, and waiting even a few minutes could be dangerous. Vanessa stood up and put her hand on Dad's arm, speaking in that soothing tone she always used when she wanted him to agree with her, saying that ambulances cost thousands of dollars and caused unnecessary panic. She reminded Dad that I'd been under a lot of stress preparing for this competition, that I'd been training obsessively for months, and that young athletes often experienced psychosomatic symptoms when facing high-pressure situations. Dad looked between me, writhing on the track, and Vanessa's confident expression, and I watched him actually consider her argument while my teammates stared in disbelief. The fact that he was weighing the cost of an ambulance against my ability to breathe properly made something crack in my chest that had nothing to do with the physical pain. Vanessa suggested they could drive me home to rest and see if the symptoms improved, saying that if it was really serious, the pain wouldn't go away, and they could reassess then. She explained that her roommate in college had experienced similar episodes during finals week and had been diagnosed with stress-induced chest pain that resolved with rest and breathing exercises. Coach Ramsey looked at Dad with an expression of pure disbelief and said that he couldn't legally prevent them from taking me, but that he was documenting this decision and would be filing a report with the athletic department. My teammate Derek pulled out his phone and started recording, saying loudly that he wanted evidence of what was happening in case something went wrong. Vanessa glared at him and told him to put his phone away, that he was being dramatic and making the situation worse by creating a scene. Dad agreed with her and told Derek to stop filming, then helped me to my feet while I clutched my chest and tried to explain that the pain was intensifying and I needed real medical attention. The walk to Dad's car in the parking lot took forever because I kept having to stop and lean against him, unable to catch my breath properly. Vanessa got in the passenger seat and immediately started searching on her phone for stress management techniques, reading aloud about deep breathing exercises and progressive muscle relaxation. Dad started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot while I lay across the back seat, curled into a fetal position with both arms wrapped around my chest. The pain had evolved from sharp stabbing sensations into a crushing pressure that made me feel like my ribcage was collapsing inward, and I could feel my heartbeat becoming irregular, skipping beats, and then racing to catch up. I tried to tell Dad that something was seriously wrong, that this felt nothing like anxiety, but Vanessa turned around and explained that panic attacks often felt like heart attacks, and that the more I focused on the symptoms, the worse they would become. She coached me through breathing exercises that made the pain spike with each attempted deep breath, and when I cried out, she said I was hyperventilating and making everything worse. Dad kept driving toward home instead of toward the hospital, following Vanessa's directions to stay calm and avoid overreacting to what she insisted was a stress response. My vision started tunneling, the edges going dark and sparkly, like I was looking through a shrinking hole. I could hear my voice getting weaker as I begged them to turn around and go to the emergency room, but Vanessa just kept talking in that maddeningly calm tone about how catastrophizing symptoms was a common feature of anxiety disorders. She told Dad that taking me to the ER would just reinforce my belief that something was physically wrong and create a pattern of seeking medical attention for psychological issues. Dad agreed that he didn't want me developing hypochondriac tendencies, and they discussed my supposed anxiety as if I wasn't dying in the back seat behind them. The crushing sensation in my chest intensified until I couldn't speak anymore, could only make small, gasping sounds that they apparently interpreted as hyperventilation rather than genuine respiratory distress. Vanessa suggested that once we got home, she could make chamomile tea and we could practice mindfulness meditation, and Dad said that sounded like a good plan, that maybe this was a wake-up call about how much pressure I'd been putting on myself with athletics. We pulled into our driveway, and Dad came around to help me out of the car. But when I tried to stand, my legs buckled completely, and I collapsed onto the concrete. The impact sent a fresh wave of agony through my chest, and I vomited onto the driveway, my vision going completely white for several seconds. Vanessa made a disgusted sound and stepped back to avoid getting anything on her expensive sneakers, while Dad tried to lift me by my arms. My body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds and nothing was responding correctly, and when Dad finally got me upright, I could feel my consciousness slipping away in waves. They half-dragged, half-carried me into the house and laid me on the couch in the living room, where I immediately curled back into that fetal position, struggling to breathe through what felt like broken glass in my lungs. Vanessa disappeared into the kitchen to make her tea, while Dad sat on the coffee table and told me to take slow, deep breaths and try to relax. The irony of being told to relax while potentially dying would have been funny if I'd had enough oxygen to laugh. The pain reached a crescendo that made me scream, a raw sound that finally seemed to penetrate Dad's denial. He pulled out his phone and started dialing 911, but Vanessa rushed back from the kitchen and grabbed his wrist, saying we needed to give the relaxation techniques time to work. She explained that calling an ambulance now would result in thousands of dollars in medical bills for what was clearly a panic attack, and that emergency rooms were notorious for running expensive tests on young people with anxiety symptoms. Dad lowered his phone and looked at me with this conflicted expression, like he was calculating the cost of my life against his bank account balance. I tried to tell him that I was dying, that something had ruptured or torn inside me, but the words came out as incomprehensible gasping sounds. Vanessa knelt beside the couch and felt my forehead, pronouncing that I didn't have a fever and that my color was fine, completely ignoring the gray pallor that had apparently taken over my skin. She told Dad that I was being manipulative, using physical symptoms to get attention and avoid taking responsibility for my anxiety. My little sister Autumn came downstairs and froze when she saw me on the couch, immediately asking what was wrong and why nobody was calling for help. She was only 14 but had taken a first aid course at school, and she recognized that my symptoms indicated a medical emergency. Vanessa intercepted her before she could reach me and explained in that condescending tone that I was having a panic attack and needed calm, quiet support rather than people reinforcing my catastrophic thinking. Autumn argued that I looked like I was dying and that her first aid instructor had specifically taught them that chest pain in young people should always be treated as an emergency until proven otherwise. Vanessa dismissed her concerns by saying that first aid courses taught people to overreact to every symptom, and that real medical experience like her, nursing school background, provided better judgment. Autumn pulled out her own phone and started calling 911, but Dad took it from her and told her to go back upstairs, that Vanessa knew what she was doing, and he trusted her assessment. The look Autumn gave him before she ran upstairs contained a mixture of disgust and disbelief that I felt echoing in my own fading consciousness. The crushing pain in my chest suddenly intensified to a level I didn't know was possible, and I felt something fundamentally wrong happen inside my body, like a cable snapping under too much tension. My vision went completely dark, and I could hear Dad and Vanessa's voices getting distant and distorted, and the last thing I remember thinking was that my father had chosen to believe his girlfriend of 8 months over the evidence that I was dying right in front of him. When I regained consciousness, I was lying on a gurney in what looked like an ambulance, with 2 paramedics working over me and attaching various monitors and IVs. One of them was asking me questions about the pain and when it had started, but my throat felt raw, and I could only manage whispered responses. The other paramedic was on the radio giving information to the hospital, and I heard him say something about suspected aortic dissection and that we were coming in hot with lights and sirens. The words meant nothing to me then, but the urgency in his voice made it clear that whatever was wrong was life-threatening and time-critical. I asked in a raspy whisper how I'd gotten into the ambulance, and the first paramedic explained that my sister had called 911 from her room using her laptop when Dad took her phone, and that they'd arrived to find me unconscious on the couch with Dad and his girlfriend arguing about whether I was faking. He said that if Autumn hadn't called when she did, I probably wouldn't have survived another 30 minutes, and that the delay in getting care had already put me in critical condition. The ambulance hit a bump that sent lightning bolts of pain through my chest, and I must have cried out because the paramedic immediately adjusted something on the IV line and told me he was giving me more pain medication. The ride seemed to take both forever and no time at all, and then we were pulling into an ambulance bay, and I was being rushed through automatic doors into a blindingly bright emergency room. Medical personnel in scrubs descended on me from all directions, cutting off my track uniform and attaching electrode stickers all over my chest and abdomen. Someone kept asking me to rate my pain on a scale of 1 to 10, and I kept saying 11, 12, infinity, trying to communicate that this was beyond any scale they could measure. A doctor appeared and introduced herself as Dr. Felicity Okafor, explaining that they were going to do an emergency CT scan because they suspected something called an aortic dissection. She asked if I understood what that meant, and I shook my head, barely able to focus through the pain and fear. Dr. Okafor explained quickly that the aorta was the main artery carrying blood from the heart to the rest of the body, and that a dissection meant the inner layer of the artery had torn, allowing blood to flow between the layers and potentially causing the artery to rupture completely. She said that in someone my age, this was extremely rare and usually indicated an underlying genetic condition that nobody had known about. The word rupture made my stomach drop, because even through the haze of pain medication, I understood that rupture meant death. Dr. Okafor squeezed my shoulder and said they had one of the best cardiac surgery teams in the region and that they were going to do everything possible to save my life, but that I needed to understand how serious this was. She needed to know if my father was here to sign consent forms, and I managed to tell her that he'd been the one who refused to call 911 in the first place. Her expression changed completely, a flash of something that might have been anger or disbelief crossing her face before she controlled it back to professional neutrality. She said they'd deal with that later, but right now every second counted, and they needed to get me into the CT scanner immediately. 2 orderlies unlocked the gurney wheels and started pushing me down a hallway at nearly a run, with Dr. Okafor jogging alongside, giving orders to various staff members. We entered a room with a massive white machine, and they transferred me onto the scanning table, telling me I needed to stay absolutely still even though the movement made me want to scream. A technician explained that the contrast dye they'd injected might make me feel warm or like I was wetting myself, but that was normal and I shouldn't panic. The scan itself only took a few minutes, but lying there unable to move while waves of pain rolled through my chest felt like being trapped in an endless nightmare. Through the window into the control room, I could see Dr. Okafor looking at the monitor, and even from a distance, I could see her face go serious as the images appeared on the screen. They pulled me out of the scanner, and Dr. Okafor came to stand beside the table, speaking quickly and clearly. The scan had confirmed an extensive type A aortic dissection that had already extended from just above my heart valve all the way into the arteries supplying my brain. She explained that this type of dissection was immediately life-threatening and required emergency open-heart surgery within hours, not days, to prevent the aorta from rupturing completely. She said that the surgery would involve opening my chest, stopping my heart, putting me on a bypass machine, and replacing the damaged section of aorta with a synthetic graft. The risks included stroke, paralysis, kidney failure, bleeding, infection, and death on the operating table, but without surgery, I would definitely die, probably within the next few hours. She needed my father here immediately to sign consent forms, because as a minor, I couldn't consent to surgery myself, no matter how life-saving it was. I tried to tell her that I didn't trust Dad to make the right decision after what he'd already done, but she said legally she had no choice but to get parental consent. They wheeled me to a room in what a nurse called the cardiac ICU while someone tried to reach Dad by phone. I could hear parts of the conversation from the hallway, with Dr. Okafor speaking in clipped, professional tones about the severity of my condition and the immediate need for surgical intervention. When Dad finally arrived 45 minutes later, he looked shaken and scared, but Vanessa was still with him, and I felt a surge of anger that cut through the pain medication fog. Dr. Okafor took them both to a consultation room, and I could hear her voice through the door, explaining in detail what had happened, what the surgery would involve, and what had caused the dissection. She said that I had a previously undiagnosed genetic condition called Marfan syndrome, which affected the connective tissue throughout my body and made the walls of my aorta weak and prone to tearing. The condition was hereditary, which meant one of my biological parents had to be carrying the gene, and I would need genetic testing to confirm the diagnosis and determine which parent had passed it to me. Vanessa's voice came through the door, asking if stress and anxiety could have triggered the dissection, and I heard Dr. Okafor's response turn cold. She explained that while physical exertion could be a trigger in someone with an undiagnosed aortic aneurysm, the underlying cause was genetic, and the dissection would have happened eventually regardless of stress levels. What the delay in treatment had done was allow the dissection to extend further up the aorta and cause more damage to surrounding vessels, significantly complicating the surgery and reducing my chances of a good outcome. She said that based on the timestamps from the 911 call and my arrival at the hospital, there had been approximately 90 minutes between when I first showed symptoms and when I received appropriate medical care. In cases of aortic dissection, every minute of delay increased the risk of permanent complications or death, and the 90-minute delay had potentially cost me kidney function, increased my stroke risk, and made the surgical repair much more complex. The silence that followed her explanation felt heavy and accusatory, and I could picture Dad's face going pale as he realized what his decision had actually cost. Dad came into my room alone a few minutes later, with consent forms in his shaking hands. He sat down in the chair next to my bed and tried to apologize, but I turned my head away and refused to look at him. He said that Vanessa had seemed so certain it was just anxiety, and that he'd trusted her medical knowledge because she'd been in nursing school. I pointed out that she'd dropped out of nursing school after one semester and had no actual medical credentials, but that he'd believed her over me, over Coach Ramsey who'd wanted to call 911 immediately, and over his own daughter who was literally dying on his couch. Dad started crying and saying he'd made a terrible mistake, that he hadn't understood how serious it was. But I cut him off and told him that he'd had multiple people telling him it was serious and he'd chosen Vanessa's convenient narrative instead. The hurt look on his face would have made me feel guilty before all this, but now I just felt empty and betrayed. I asked him where Vanessa was, and he said she was in the waiting room, and I told him that if he let her anywhere near me before or after surgery, I would refuse to sign any future medical documents when I turned 18, and he could deal with the consequences. Dr. Okafor returned with a cardiac surgeon named Dr. Rashid Kumar, who explained the surgical procedure in detail, while Dad signed form after form. Dr. Kumar said they'd be replacing my ascending aorta and aortic arch with a Dacron graft, which meant cutting out the damaged section and sewing in a synthetic tube to replace it. The surgery would take between 6 and 8 hours and would require stopping my heart and cooling my body temperature to protect my brain while they worked on the vessels supplying it. He explained the risks again, emphasizing that my age worked in my favor, but the extent of the dissection and the delay in treatment worked against me. When Dad asked about recovery time, Dr. Kumar said that if everything went perfectly, I'd spend at least a week in the ICU, several more weeks in the hospital, and months in cardiac rehabilitation. I'd never be able to participate in competitive athletics again because the stress on my cardiovascular system could cause the graft to fail or create new dissections in other parts of my aorta. The words hit me like a physical blow because running track had been my entire identity, my college scholarship plan, my future. 2 surgical nurses came to prep me for the operating room, explaining each step as they shaved my chest and marked the incision site. One of them mentioned that she'd be in the OR with me the whole time and would make sure I was comfortable and safe. Autumn appeared in the doorway with tears streaming down her face, and the nurses let her come in for a few minutes to say goodbye. She hugged me carefully, avoiding the IV lines and monitors, and whispered that she was sorry she hadn't called 911 sooner, that she'd wasted time arguing with Dad and Vanessa when she should have just locked herself in her room and called immediately. I told her that she'd saved my life by calling at all, that if she hadn't been brave enough to defy Dad, I'd be dead right now. She made me promise I'd survive the surgery, and I said I'd try my hardest, but couldn't guarantee anything because this was out of my control now. Dad tried to hug me before they took me away, but I kept my arms at my sides and didn't return the embrace, and the wounded expression on his face told me he understood that something fundamental had broken between us that might never be repaired. They wheeled me through a series of doors into a surgical prep area where an anesthesiologist introduced himself as Dr. Leon Webb and explained that he'd be managing my anesthesia and vital signs throughout the procedure. He started adding medications to my IV while explaining that I'd go to sleep here in the prep area and wake up in the ICU, that I wouldn't remember anything from the surgery itself. A nurse held my hand and told me to count backwards from 100, and I got to maybe 93 before the world dissolved into chemical darkness. The nothingness lasted for what felt like both seconds and eternity, and then I was swimming up through layers of consciousness, trying to figure out why I couldn't breathe and why my chest felt like it had been crushed by a truck. I tried to reach for the thing in my throat, but my hands were restrained, and I started panicking and fighting against the restraints until voices cut through the confusion, telling me I was okay, that I was in the ICU, that I was still on a ventilator, but they'd remove the breathing tube soon. The pain was extraordinary despite whatever medications they were giving me, a deep, aching throb that radiated from my sternum through my entire torso. Dr. Kumar appeared above me and explained that the surgery had gone as well as could be expected given the circumstances. They'd successfully replaced my ascending aorta and aortic arch with a graft, and my heart was functioning on its own again without mechanical support. However, the dissection had caused more damage than the scans had shown, extending into some of the smaller vessels supplying my kidneys and intestines. My kidney function was currently impaired, and they were monitoring closely to see if it would recover or if I'd need dialysis. There was also some concern about reduced blood flow to my spinal cord during the period when my body had been cooled, and they'd be doing neurological assessments once the breathing tube came out to check for any deficits. The breathing tube was removed a few hours later in a process that felt like drowning in reverse, and my throat burned so badly I couldn't speak above a whisper. A nurse asked me to wiggle my toes, and I could feel them moving, but couldn't see them past the mountain of blankets. And she smiled, and said that was a good sign, that there didn't appear to be any spinal cord damage. Dad came to visit the next morning looking like he hadn't slept at all, with dark circles under his eyes and his clothes wrinkled like he'd been wearing them for days. He tried to sit in the chair next to my bed, but I told him in my raspy, post-intubation voice that I didn't want him here, that he'd lost the right to visit when he chose Vanessa's delusions over my life. He started crying and saying that he'd sent Vanessa home, that he'd realized she'd been manipulating him and clouding his judgment. I asked him how long it had taken him to realize that, and he admitted it had been when Dr. Okafor explained that the delay had nearly killed me, and that I'd probably need a lifetime of follow-up surgeries because of how extensively the dissection had damaged my aorta. The fact that it had taken a doctor spelling out the consequences for him to understand what he'd done made me feel sick. I told him that Autumn had understood immediately that I was dying, that Coach Ramsey had understood, that my teammates had understood, that everyone except him and his girlfriend had recognized a medical emergency when they saw one. Dad said that Vanessa had been so convincing, and I cut him off and said that I didn't care how convincing she was, that his responsibility was to his children, not to making his girlfriend happy. A social worker named Gregory Hartman came to interview me later that day about what had happened. He explained that the hospital was required to report cases where parents delayed necessary medical care for minors, and that my case was being reviewed for possible medical neglect. I walked him through everything from collapsing at the track meet to begging for help on the couch to waking up in the ambulance, and he took detailed notes while maintaining a carefully neutral expression. He asked if there had been other instances where Dad had prioritized Vanessa's opinions over my well-being, and I told him about the smaller incidents over the past 8 months, times when I'd been sick, and Vanessa had convinced Dad I was exaggerating, times when I'd needed something, and Vanessa had reframed it as me being demanding or manipulative, times when my needs had conflicted with Vanessa's plans, and Dad had sided with her. Gregory said he'd be interviewing Dad, Vanessa, Autumn, and Coach Ramsey as well, and that his findings would determine whether the case was referred to Child Protective Services. The thought of a CPS investigation felt both validating and terrifying, because it would confirm that what happened to me was wrong, but it might also mean Autumn would be caught up in the system. My kidneys started recovering after 3 days, which Dr. Kumar said was a relief because it meant I probably wouldn't need long-term dialysis. However, the neurological assessments revealed that I had some subtle deficits in my fine motor control and coordination, possibly from microstrokes during the surgery or from reduced blood flow during the cooling phase. An occupational therapist came to work with me on exercises to rebuild those skills, but she warned that some of the deficits might be permanent. The cardiac rehabilitation team started me on gentle exercises designed to rebuild my strength without stressing my cardiovascular system, beginning with sitting up in bed and eventually progressing to standing with a walker. Each movement felt like trying to operate a body that no longer belonged to me, every breath reminding me that my chest had been cracked open and my heart had been stopped and restarted like a machine. The psychological weight of understanding how close I'd come to dying, because my father believed his girlfriend instead of multiple medical professionals, created a trauma that sat heavy in my chest, alongside the physical pain. Autumn smuggled her laptop into the ICU one evening and showed me that Derek had posted the video he'd filmed at the track meet on social media, captioning it with a detailed explanation of what had happened. The video clearly showed me collapsed on the track in obvious distress, showed Coach Ramsey trying to call 911, showed Dad stopping him after Vanessa's intervention, and showed them walking me to the car instead of waiting for an ambulance. The comments section exploded with outrage, with hundreds of people calling Dad's decision criminally negligent and demanding he face consequences. Several people who identified as medical professionals explained what an aortic dissection was and why every second of delay increased the risk of death or permanent disability. Others shared their own stories of parents who'd dismissed serious medical symptoms, creating a thread of collective trauma around inadequate parental response to health emergencies. The video had been viewed over 100,000 times in just 3 days, and local news outlets had started picking up the story. Autumn said she'd been interviewed by 2 reporters who'd shown up at our house, and that she'd told them everything about Dad choosing Vanessa's opinion over my life. Coach Ramsey visited with a card signed by the entire track team and explained that he'd filed a formal complaint with both the athletic department and the school district about Dad's decision to refuse emergency medical care at the track meet. He said the athletic director had launched an investigation and was considering implementing new policies requiring parental consent forms that explicitly waived the school's liability if parents refused emergency medical treatment. The team had also voted to dedicate their next meet to me and were wearing ribbons with my race number in my honor. He told me that my spot on the team would be waiting for me if I ever recovered enough to run again, even though we both knew that was impossible now. The genetic testing had confirmed Marfan syndrome, and Dr. Kumar had explained that people with that condition could never participate in competitive sports because the cardiovascular stress could trigger additional dissections or cause the surgical graft to fail. Everything I'd worked toward for the past 6 years of my life, all the training and dedication and sacrifice, had been erased in the 90 minutes between when I collapsed and when Autumn called 911. The news coverage intensified when a reporter named Jennifer Larson published an investigative piece about Vanessa's background. She'd dropped out of nursing school after 1 semester, but had been telling people for years that she had medical training, using that fake credential to give authority to her opinions. Jennifer had interviewed 3 of Vanessa's previous boyfriends who all reported similar patterns. Vanessa would insert herself into medical situations, diagnose people with psychological conditions rather than physical illnesses, and convince family members to delay seeking professional care. One ex described his mother having a stroke while Vanessa insisted it was a migraine and anxiety, and by the time they finally got her to the hospital, the damage was irreversible. Another told a story about his daughter breaking her arm and Vanessa insisting it was just bruised, resulting in the bone healing improperly and requiring surgical rebreaking and resetting. The article painted a picture of a woman who used false medical expertise to control the people around her, with Dad being just the latest victim of her manipulation. The story went viral, and suddenly my case became part of a larger conversation about medical misinformation and the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people with limited knowledge felt overly confident in their abilities. Dad was fired from his job at the accounting firm after the partners decided that the negative publicity and questions about his judgment made him a liability. He tried to explain that his personal life shouldn't affect his professional standing, but they pointed out that if he couldn't be trusted to make critical decisions about his son's life, clients might question his ability to make critical decisions about their finances. The local prosecutor's office opened an investigation into whether Dad's actions constituted criminal child endangerment, and Gregory Hartman's report to CPS concluded that Dad had demonstrated grossly negligent judgment that endangered the life of his minor child. CPS didn't remove Autumn from the home, but they placed our family on a monitoring list and required Dad to complete parenting classes and regular home visits. Dad hired a lawyer named Dennis Kowalski, who tried to argue that Dad had been manipulated by Vanessa and shouldn't face criminal charges for being deceived. The prosecutor countered that multiple people had told Dad it was a medical emergency, including a coach and his own teenage son, and that choosing to believe his girlfriend over all those voices demonstrated willful disregard for my safety. I was transferred out of the ICU after 9 days and moved to a regular cardiac recovery floor where the beeping and alarms were less constant. Physical therapy intensified with therapists working on rebuilding my strength and endurance, while carefully monitoring my heart rate and blood pressure to ensure I wasn't overexerting my healing cardiovascular system. Walking from my bed to the bathroom left me exhausted and shaking, my sternum aching from where they'd cut through the bone to access my heart. The occupational therapist continued working on my fine motor skills, having me practice writing and manipulating small objects to retrain the neural pathways damaged by the microstrokes. Progress was maddeningly slow, each tiny improvement feeling insignificant compared to the massive loss of capability I'd experienced. I'd gone from running 5-minute miles to struggling to walk 50 feet, from planning to compete at the collegiate level to wondering if I'd ever be able to carry groceries again. The grief for my lost future hit me in waves, usually late at night when the pain medication wore thin and I couldn't sleep. Vanessa's case became even more complicated when 2 more of her former partners came forward with stories of medical manipulation. One described Vanessa convincing him that his daughter's persistent headaches were attention-seeking behavior rather than the brain tumor they turned out to be, and the delayed diagnosis had resulted in a worse prognosis and more aggressive treatment. Another told about Vanessa insisting his elderly father's confusion was normal aging rather than a urinary tract infection, which had progressed to sepsis before proper treatment was sought. The pattern was undeniable. Vanessa systematically dismissed serious medical symptoms as psychological issues, delayed appropriate care, and used her fake nursing credentials to give weight to her dangerous advice. A prosecutor in the neighboring county opened an investigation into whether Vanessa could be charged with practicing medicine without a license, and the state medical board started reviewing whether there were grounds for action even though she'd never actually been licensed. Dad's lawyer tried to use these revelations to show that Dad had been manipulated by a predatory individual. But the prosecutor maintained that Dad was still responsible for his own choices regarding his minor child's welfare. The hospital social work department connected me with a therapist named Dr. Nina Fitzgerald, who specialized in medical trauma and family conflict. She helped me process the layers of betrayal and loss, the physical trauma of the dissection and surgery, the emotional trauma of Dad choosing Vanessa over me, the grief of losing my athletic identity and future plans, and the anger at having my life permanently altered by someone else's negligence. Dr. Fitzgerald explained that what I was experiencing was complex trauma because it involved betrayal by someone who should have protected me, and that rebuilding trust would be a long process that might never completely heal. She asked if I wanted to do family therapy sessions with Dad, and I said I wasn't ready yet, that I needed to focus on my own recovery before dealing with repairing that relationship. The relief on her face suggested she'd expected that answer and approved of me prioritizing my own needs over reconciliation. She gave me permission to be angry, to grieve, to feel whatever I felt, without pressure to forgive or move on before I was ready. Mom flew in from Oregon, where she'd moved after the divorce 5 years earlier. She walked into my hospital room and immediately started crying, apologizing for not being there when it happened, for not fighting harder for custody, for letting Dad have primary placement because it seemed easier at the time. I told her that none of this was her fault, that she couldn't have known Dad would let his girlfriend's fake medical opinions override emergency medical care. She sat with me for hours while I told her the whole story from beginning to end, and I watched her expression cycle through shock, disbelief, fury, and grief. She said she was filing an emergency custody modification based on Dad's demonstrated inability to make appropriate decisions about his children's welfare, and that she wanted both Autumn and me to come live with her in Oregon once I was healthy enough to travel. The thought of leaving my school and friends and teammates felt like another loss on top of all the others, but staying with Dad after what he'd done felt impossible. Mom met with Dennis Kowalski and made it clear that she wouldn't be satisfied with parenting classes and monitoring, that Dad needed to face real consequences for nearly killing me. The genetic testing revealed that I'd inherited the Marfan syndrome gene from Dad, which meant he had the condition too, but had never been diagnosed because his symptoms were milder. Dr. Kumar explained that Dad needed to be evaluated by a cardiologist immediately, because people with Marfan syndrome could develop aortic aneurysms at any age, and the condition was progressive. The irony that Dad had an undiagnosed genetic condition that could kill him, just like it had nearly killed me, felt like cosmic justice. Dr. Kumar reached out to Dad's primary care physician and strongly recommended a cardiac workup, including echocardiogram and CT angiography, to check for aortic dilation. Autumn also needed to be tested to determine if she'd inherited the gene, because if she had Marfan syndrome, she'd need regular cardiac monitoring to catch any problems before they became life-threatening. The genetic counselor explained that Marfan syndrome was autosomal dominant, meaning each of Dad's children had a 50% chance of inheriting the condition. The fact that Dad had unknowingly passed a potentially lethal genetic condition to his children and then refused to get one of them emergency medical care when that condition manifested created a layer of tragic irony that was hard to process. I was discharged from the hospital after 17 days with a medication list that filled an entire page. Beta blockers to reduce the stress on my aorta, pain medications for the surgical recovery, blood thinners to prevent clots, and medications to protect my kidneys. Mom had rented an apartment near the hospital so I could attend follow-up appointments and cardiac rehab sessions without having to travel far. Dad tried to argue about the custody arrangement, but his lawyer quietly advised him that fighting it would look terrible given the circumstances, and that he should accept the modification gracefully. The apartment was small but comfortable, and Mom had already set up one bedroom with a hospital bed she'd rented and all the medical equipment I'd need. Autumn came to stay with us immediately, bringing 2 suitcases of her belongings and telling Dad she didn't feel safe living with someone who'd ignored a medical emergency. The look on Dad's face when she said that was devastating, but she held firm, and he didn't fight her decision. Watching my 14-year-old sister have to choose between her parents because Dad had demonstrated such catastrophically poor judgment felt like another crime on top of all the others. Cardiac rehab started 2 days after discharge with gentle exercises designed to rebuild my cardiovascular fitness without stressing my healing aorta. The therapist, a woman named Patricia Chen, who immediately told me to call her Trish, explained that we'd be starting with 5-minute sessions of slow walking and gradually building up over months to more intense activity. She emphasized that I'd never be able to return to competitive running, that the stress on my cardiovascular system from high-intensity athletics could cause the graft to fail or trigger new dissections in other parts of my aorta. Each session felt like both progress and loss. Progress because I was getting stronger and more capable. Loss because I was building toward a ceiling far below what I used to be able to do. Trish was endlessly patient and encouraging, but I could see the pity in her eyes when I'd get frustrated and angry about my limitations. She recommended I connect with support groups for young people with cardiac conditions, saying it helped to talk to others who understood what it was like to have your body betray you and your future plans evaporate overnight. The criminal case against Dad moved forward, despite Dennis Kowalski's best efforts to get the charges dismissed. The prosecutor charged him with reckless endangerment of a child, arguing that Dad's decision to ignore clear signs of a medical emergency and delay appropriate care for 90 minutes constituted criminal negligence. The evidence was overwhelming. Derek's video showing the collapse and Dad's refusal to call 911, testimony from Coach Ramsey about the obvious distress I was in, paramedic reports documenting my critical condition upon their arrival, and medical records proving that the delay had worsened my outcome and reduced my chances of full recovery. Dad's defense rested on the argument that he'd been manipulated by Vanessa and genuinely believed I was having a panic attack. But the prosecutor countered that multiple people had told him it was serious and that choosing to believe his girlfriend over everyone else demonstrated willful disregard rather than honest mistake. The preliminary hearing resulted in the case being bound over for trial, with the judge noting that there was sufficient evidence for a jury to find that Dad's actions had endangered my life. Vanessa was charged separately with practicing medicine without a license after the investigation uncovered at least 7 incidents where she'd given medical advice that led to delayed treatment and worse outcomes. The prosecutor argued that her pattern of behavior demonstrated a consistent practice of diagnosing conditions and recommending treatment despite having no credentials or training beyond 1 semester of nursing school. Her lawyer tried to claim that she'd been offering friendly advice rather than practicing medicine, but the specific nature of her pronouncements, the terminology she used, and her invocation of her supposed nursing background all supported the prosecution's case. The victims from her previous relationships testified about the harm her fake expertise had caused, and the cumulative weight of the evidence painted a picture of someone who'd been systematically endangering people for years. The judge set her bail high enough that she couldn't immediately pay it, and she spent 2 weeks in jail before a bail bondsman agreed to post the bond in exchange for her putting up her car as collateral. Autumn's genetic testing came back positive for Marfan syndrome, which meant she needed to start regular cardiac monitoring immediately. Dr. Kumar arranged for her to be evaluated by a pediatric cardiologist, who found that she already had mild aortic dilation, not enough to require surgery yet, but significant enough that she needed echocardiograms every 6 months to track any progression. The cardiologist put her on beta blockers and told her she couldn't participate in high-intensity sports, which devastated her because she'd been planning to try out for the volleyball team. Mom sat with her while she cried about losing opportunities before she'd even had a chance to try them, and I understood exactly how she felt, because that had been my experience too. The genetic counselor explained that with regular monitoring and medication, many people with Marfan syndrome lived normal lifespans, but the knowledge that we both carried this time bomb in our cardiovascular systems created a bond between us and a shared resentment toward Dad for passing it on unknowingly. Dad's own cardiac evaluation revealed moderate aortic dilation that would require surgery within the next few years, meaning he'd eventually experience a fraction of what he'd put me through. The media attention evolved from local news coverage to national interest after a medical ethics professor at a nearby university wrote an op-ed about my case for a major newspaper. She used my story as an example of the dangers of medical misinformation and the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people with minimal knowledge felt overly confident in their understanding of complex medical issues. The article discussed how social media and fake expertise had created an environment where parents felt empowered to override professional medical judgment based on internet research or advice from unqualified individuals. My case became a cautionary tale taught in emergency medicine and medical ethics courses, an example of what happens when laypeople substitute their judgment for professional medical assessment in time-critical situations. The professor reached out through the hospital to ask if she could interview me for a follow-up piece, and after discussing it with Mom and Dr. Fitzgerald, I agreed, because I wanted my experience to prevent similar situations for other teenagers. The interview was emotionally exhausting, walking through every detail of that day and its aftermath, but the professor treated my story with respect and gravity. Dad's trial began 4 months after my dissection, and I had to testify about what happened that day at the track meet and afterward at home. The courtroom felt surreal, with Dad sitting at the defense table looking smaller and older than I remembered, and a jury of 12 strangers deciding whether his actions constituted criminal behavior. I walked through the timeline for the prosecution, the chest pain during warm-ups, Coach Ramsey trying to call 911, Vanessa's intervention and claims about panic attacks, the drive home instead of to the hospital, lying on the couch begging for help while they made tea and told me to relax, the 90 minutes of worsening symptoms before Autumn finally called 911 from her room. The prosecutor asked me to describe the pain and fear I'd experienced, and I told them about feeling like my chest was tearing apart from the inside, about watching my father weigh the cost of an ambulance against my life, about understanding that I was dying while the people who should have protected me debated whether I was being dramatic. The jury looked horrified, and I could see several of them glancing at Dad with expressions that ranged from anger to disbelief. Dennis Kowalski cross-examined me, trying to establish that I'd seemed anxious and that Dad had reasonable grounds to believe Vanessa's assessment. He asked if I'd been under stress from training and competition pressure, if I'd experienced anxiety before big meets, if there was any way Dad could have known this was different from other times I'd felt nervous. I answered honestly that yes, I'd been stressed and nervous before, but that I'd never experienced anything remotely like the pain of an aortic dissection, and that I'd clearly communicated how different and severe this was. He asked if Vanessa had seemed confident and knowledgeable, and I said yes, but that Dad had other sources of information beyond Vanessa, including a coach with first aid training and his own son desperately begging for emergency medical care. The cross-examination felt like being forced to defend the legitimacy of my own suffering, to prove that I'd been really sick enough to warrant immediate attention. After an hour of questioning, the judge called a recess, and I went into the hallway and threw up in a bathroom, the stress and recalled trauma overwhelming my carefully maintained composure. Coach Ramsey testified about trying to call 911 and being stopped by Dad after Vanessa's intervention, describing my obvious distress and the inappropriate dismissal of clear warning signs. The paramedics testified about finding me unconscious on the couch with critically low blood pressure, and Dad arguing with Vanessa about whether I was faking. Dr. Kumar testified about the extensive aortic dissection, the emergency surgery, the complications from the delay in treatment, and the permanent limitations I'd face for the rest of my life. He explained in technical detail how every minute of delay had increased the risk of death or disability, and how the 90-minute gap between symptom onset and receiving appropriate care had been catastrophic. Jennifer Larson, the reporter who'd investigated Vanessa's background, testified about the pattern of medical manipulation she'd uncovered, providing context for why Vanessa's advice had been so dangerous and why Dad should have questioned her confidence. The prosecution built a comprehensive case that Dad had ignored multiple red flags and trusted the opinion of an unqualified person over clear evidence of a medical emergency, resulting in life-threatening consequences for his minor child. The defense called Vanessa as a witness, which surprised everyone because she was facing her own criminal charges. She testified that she genuinely believed I was having a panic attack based on her nursing school training and experience with anxiety disorders. Under cross-examination, the prosecutor forced her to admit that she'd only completed one semester of nursing school, that she'd failed her anatomy and physiology course, and that she'd never received training in emergency medical assessment. He presented evidence of her pattern of misdiagnosing serious conditions as psychological issues and asked her to explain why she'd been so confident in her assessment, despite multiple people disagreeing with her. Vanessa became defensive and argumentative, insisting that she'd been trying to help and that everyone was blaming her for Dad's decisions. The prosecutor asked if she'd been more concerned about the cost of an ambulance than the possibility that she was wrong, and she fumbled for an answer that made her look callous and self-serving. Her testimony probably hurt Dad's case more than it helped, showing the jury exactly what kind of person had been advising him. Dad took the stand in his own defense and tried to explain his decision-making that day. He described feeling torn between different sources of advice, trusting Vanessa because of their relationship and her supposed medical background, and genuinely not understanding how serious the situation was until it was too late. Under cross-examination, the prosecutor dismantled his explanation by presenting Derek's video, which showed undeniable evidence that I was in severe distress and that multiple people had recognized it as an emergency. The prosecutor asked Dad why he'd trusted Vanessa, who he'd known for 8 months, over Coach Ramsey, who had first aid training and years of experience with athletic injuries, and over me, his own son, who was begging for help. Dad couldn't provide a satisfactory answer beyond saying he'd made a terrible mistake in judgment. The prosecutor asked if the cost of the ambulance had factored into his decision, and Dad hesitated just long enough before denying it that the jury could see the truth. The final question was devastating in its simplicity. If you had to make the same decision today, with the knowledge that your son nearly died and will be disabled for life because of that 90-minute delay, would you make the same choice? Dad broke down crying and said no, and the prosecutor rested his case. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on the charge of reckless endangerment of a child. Dad sat with his head in his hands while the verdict was read, and I felt a complicated mixture of relief and grief watching him comprehend that his choices had criminal consequences. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later and remanded Dad to custody pending the sentencing hearing, which meant he was immediately taken into jail. Autumn started crying when the bailiff led Dad away in handcuffs, and Mom put her arm around her while I sat frozen in my seat, trying to process that my father was going to prison because he'd chosen his girlfriend's opinion over my life. The local news covered the verdict extensively, with legal experts discussing the precedent it might set for parental responsibility in medical emergencies. Some commentators argued that the verdict was too harsh, that Dad had made an honest mistake under pressure from a manipulative partner, while others insisted that parents had a basic obligation to prioritize their children's welfare over relationship dynamics and financial concerns. Vanessa's trial happened 2 months later, and I didn't attend, not wanting to relive the trauma again or see her face. Mom went and reported back that Vanessa had been found guilty of practicing medicine without a license and received a 2-year prison sentence plus 5 years of probation. The judge in her case had been particularly harsh, noting that her pattern of behavior showed deliberate exploitation of people's trust and that her fake expertise had endangered multiple people over several years. Vanessa's lawyer filed an appeal immediately, but the conviction stood and she began serving her sentence at a women's correctional facility 3 hours away. I felt no satisfaction in her imprisonment, just a tired sort of acknowledgement that at least there had been consequences for her actions. The victims from her previous relationships testified at her sentencing hearing about the harm she'd caused, and their stories created a record of systematic endangerment that the judge cited in explaining the sentence length. Some small comfort existed in knowing she wouldn't be able to give dangerous medical advice to anyone else for at least 2 years. Dad's sentencing hearing felt more emotionally complex, because despite everything, he was still my father, and I couldn't completely separate my anger at his actions from the grief of losing him to his own bad choices. The prosecution recommended an 18-month prison sentence, followed by probation, while the defense asked for probation only with community service and parenting classes. Dr. Kumar testified about my permanent limitations and ongoing medical needs, emphasizing that I'd require additional surgeries in the future to maintain the aortic graft and that my life expectancy had been reduced by the damage to my cardiovascular system. Mom testified about the financial and emotional toll of my medical care, the custody modification, and the complete rupture of trust between Dad and his children. Autumn submitted a written statement saying she loved Dad, but couldn't forgive him for prioritizing Vanessa's opinion over my life, and that she needed him to face real consequences before she could even consider rebuilding their relationship. The judge listened to all the testimony and impact statements before pronouncing sentence: 12 months in county jail, followed by 3 years of probation, with conditions including completion of parenting classes, regular therapy, and ongoing participation in my medical care decisions under supervision. The sentence felt simultaneously too harsh and too lenient, enough to disrupt Dad's life significantly, but nowhere near proportional to what he'd done to mine. Cardiac rehab continued throughout all the legal proceedings, and 8 months after my dissection, I'd progressed to the point where I could walk several miles without significant fatigue. Trish said I'd made remarkable progress, but reminded me constantly that I needed to stay within my prescribed heart rate zones and avoid any activities that could spike my blood pressure or put stress on my cardiovascular system. The fine motor deficits from the microstrokes had mostly resolved with occupational therapy, though I still had occasional coordination issues that reminded me I'd experienced brain injury during the surgery. The psychological scars ran deeper than the physical ones, manifesting as hypervigilance about my body's signals and panic attacks when I experienced any chest discomfort. Dr. Fitzgerald helped me develop coping strategies for the anxiety, but she acknowledged that having experienced a dissection made it impossible to completely trust my body again. Every twinge, every unusual sensation triggered the memory of that day and the fear that it was happening again. The cardiologist explained that I had a slightly elevated risk of future dissections and would need cardiac imaging every 6 months for the rest of my life to monitor for new problems. College plans had to be completely revised now that competitive athletics were off the table. The scholarship offers I'd received for track were withdrawn once schools learned about my condition and permanent limitations, which meant figuring out how to pay for college without the athletic scholarship I'd been counting on. Mom helped me apply for academic scholarships and financial aid, and I ended up accepting a spot at a state university near her home in Oregon, where I could study biology with the eventual goal of medical school. The irony of wanting to become a doctor after my own medical trauma wasn't lost on me, but Dr. Kumar said I'd bring a valuable perspective to medicine, having experienced both catastrophic illness and the consequences of delayed treatment. Autumn would be starting high school in Oregon too, and while neither of us was happy about leaving our friends and familiar environment, staying anywhere near Dad felt impossible given everything that had happened. We visited him twice in jail during his sentence, strained conversations where he tried to apologize, and we struggled to figure out what forgiveness might look like when the damage was so permanent. The Marfan syndrome diagnosis meant regular appointments with multiple specialists: cardiology for my aorta, ophthalmology because Marfan affected the eyes, orthopedics for joint issues common with the condition. I became a regular patient at several different clinics, learning to advocate for myself and ask detailed questions about treatment options and risks. The genetic counselor connected me with a support group for young adults with Marfan syndrome, and hearing other people's stories of dissections and surgeries and permanent limitations helped me feel less alone in the experience. One woman described losing her athletic scholarship and having to completely reinvent her identity, and her story mirrored mine so closely that I cried during the entire meeting. The group became a place where I could be honest about the grief and anger without having to protect anyone's feelings or worry about being judged for not having moved on yet. They understood that chronic illness and lifelong limitations weren't things you got over, but things you learned to carry while building whatever life was possible within the constraints. Dad was released from jail after serving 10 months with good behavior, and he moved to a small apartment near Mom's place in Oregon to be closer to Autumn and me. The conditions of his probation included supervised visitation only, meaning a social worker had to be present during any contact with his minor child, and he had to participate in family therapy sessions if we agreed to them. Autumn and I met with Dr. Fitzgerald to discuss whether we wanted to engage in that process, and she emphasized that we had no obligation to forgive or reconcile if we didn't want to, that our healing didn't require repairing the relationship with Dad. I decided to try family therapy because I wanted answers to questions that still haunted me. Why he'd valued Vanessa's opinion more than my life, what had made him so susceptible to her manipulation, whether he understood the permanence of what his choice had cost me. Autumn chose not to participate yet, saying she needed more time before she could sit in a room with Dad and hear his explanations without rage overwhelming her. The family therapy sessions were brutal and honest in ways that normal family conversations never allowed. Dad described how Vanessa had isolated him from other relationships gradually, how she'd positioned herself as the only person who really understood him, how she'd undermined his confidence in his own judgment about everything from work decisions to parenting choices. He explained that by the time I collapsed at the track meet, he'd been conditioned to defer to her opinion even when it contradicted his own instincts and the advice of others. The therapist helped me understand that Dad's susceptibility to manipulation didn't excuse his choices, but did provide context for how someone could make such catastrophically bad decisions. I asked him directly if saving money on an ambulance had been part of his calculation, and he admitted after a long pause that Vanessa had been pressuring him about finances and that the cost had been somewhere in his mind, even though he didn't want to acknowledge it. Hearing him admit that financial considerations had played any role in letting me nearly die made me want to leave the session, but the therapist guided us through the rage toward something more productive. Physical recovery plateaued around the 1-year mark, with Trish explaining that I'd probably reached my maximum cardiac capacity and shouldn't expect significant additional improvement. I could walk and do gentle exercise but would never run again, never participate in competitive sports, never push my body to its limits without risking another dissection or graft failure. The loss of that physical capability felt like grief that never quite resolved, showing up unexpectedly when I saw people running in the park or when my former teammates posted photos from track meets. Dr. Fitzgerald helped me work through the identity crisis of no longer being an athlete after that had defined me for so many years, helping me understand that I could build a new identity that incorporated my medical experience without being consumed by it. Some days, I believed her, and some days, I felt like I was just going through the motions of being a functioning person while internally grieving everything I'd lost. College started with accommodations from the Disability Services Office, priority registration so I could schedule classes close together and minimize walking, permission to audio record lectures in case fatigue affected my concentration, and flexibility for medical appointments that couldn't be rescheduled. My biology professors were generally understanding when I explained that I'd experienced an aortic dissection and had ongoing cardiac limitations, and several went out of their way to ensure I had the support I needed to succeed academically. I met other students with chronic illnesses and disabilities, and finding a community of people who understood what it meant to navigate college while managing significant health issues made the experience less isolating. One friend had juvenile arthritis that limited her mobility, Another had type 1 diabetes with serious complications, and together we formed a study group that accommodated everyone's medical needs and created space for discussing the emotional toll of being chronically ill in our late teens and early 20s. Autumn came to a family therapy session after 6 months of Dad attending alone with me, and her anger was fresh and raw compared to my tired resignation. She told Dad that he'd failed both of his children by choosing a woman he barely knew over the safety of his son, and that her positive Marfan diagnosis meant she'd spend her whole life dealing with the consequences of his genetic legacy and his terrible judgment. Dad took the criticism without defending himself, accepting responsibility in a way that felt genuine rather than performative. Autumn said she wasn't ready to forgive, but was willing to keep showing up to therapy to see if trust could eventually be rebuilt. And the therapist said that was more than enough for now. The sessions became less about relitigating what happened, and more about figuring out how to have some kind of relationship despite the permanent damage, acknowledging that we'd never be a normal family, but might eventually find a new configuration that worked for everyone. 2 years after the dissection, I had my first follow-up surgery to adjust the synthetic graft because imaging showed early signs of deterioration at one of the connection points. Dr. Kumar explained that this was expected and that I'd likely need similar surgeries every 5 to 7 years for the rest of my life to maintain the graft and monitor for new problems in other parts of my aorta. The surgery was less extensive than the original emergency procedure, but still required opening my chest again and replacing the worn section of the graft. The recovery was shorter this time, and I was back to my baseline activity level within 6 weeks, but the experience reinforced that my cardiovascular system would never be truly stable, that I'd always be one imaging result away from another surgery. The psychological toll of living with that uncertainty was sometimes harder than the physical limitations, the knowledge that my body contained this permanent weakness that could fail catastrophically at any time, despite careful monitoring and treatment. Dad completed his probation and started rebuilding his life slowly, getting a job as a bookkeeper at a small business that didn't care about his criminal record. He attended every one of my medical appointments he was allowed to, sitting quietly in waiting rooms and asking questions about my care that showed he was trying to understand what I was experiencing. The supervised visitation requirements eventually ended as the social workers determined he'd completed his mandated programs and demonstrated consistent, appropriate judgment. Autumn started spending occasional weekends with him, and they worked on repairing their relationship through shared activities that didn't require talking about the past. I maintained careful boundaries, seeing Dad regularly, but never quite letting him back into the inner circle of trust. Dr. Fitzgerald said that was healthy self-protection rather than vindictiveness, that I had no obligation to fully reconcile just because time had passed and Dad had served his sentence. The media attention gradually faded as new stories emerged, but my case remained a reference point in discussions about medical misinformation and parental responsibility. The medical ethics professor who'd written about me published a book that included a chapter analyzing my case and its broader implications, and she sent me a signed copy with a note thanking me for being willing to share my story. Reading about my experience in academic terms felt surreal, like she was analyzing someone else's tragedy rather than the event that had permanently altered my life's trajectory. The university where I was studying used my case in their medical ethics curriculum, and one of my biology professors asked if I'd be willing to speak to a medical school class about the patient experience of catastrophic illness and delayed treatment. Standing in front of future doctors and describing what it felt like to be dismissed and nearly die while begging for help was terrifying and cathartic, and several students came up afterward to say my talk had changed how they thought about trusting patients and taking symptoms seriously. Life became something other than what I'd planned, but not exactly tragic either, just different in ways that required constant adjustment and acceptance. I graduated college with honors and got accepted to medical school with the goal of becoming a cardiologist, specializing in genetic cardiac conditions. Dr. Kumar wrote one of my recommendation letters and told me I'd bring invaluable perspective to the field, having experienced both sides of the patient-physician relationship in such dramatic circumstances. Autumn finished high school and decided to study public health, interested in health communication and preventing the kind of medical misinformation that had nearly killed me. We stayed close despite the trauma that bound us, our shared genetic condition and family dysfunction creating a bond that transcended typical sibling relationships. Dad remained a peripheral figure in our lives, someone we saw regularly but never fully trusted again. The relationship permanently changed by those 90 minutes when he chose wrong. The scars on my chest faded to silver lines that marked where they'd cracked me open to save my life. And on difficult days, I'd trace them and remember that survival was its own kind of victory even when it came with permanent costs. Dr. Fitzgerald said healing wasn't about returning to who I'd been before, but about building something new from the pieces that remained, and most days I managed that even when the grief and anger still surfaced unexpectedly. Some betrayals left permanent marks regardless of consequences or apologies, and learning to live with that reality while still finding meaning and purpose became the challenge that defined my early adulthood. The fact that my father believed his girlfriend instead of getting me to the hospital would always be the defining trauma of my life, but it didn't have to be the only story worth telling about who I became afterward. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.